Assalamu alaikum. My name is Robert Travers and I come from Ireland. For many years I worked with the Northern Ireland Tourist Board at a time when Belfast was having many difficulties, many political problems and a very bad image. But today Belfast is said to be the #1 city break destination in Europe. It has become a very popular place and a very fashionable place to visit. So I hope I have a message of hope for you. I have also worked in Rwanda, where terrible things happened, but they have managed to recover and to rebuild their tourism industry there. However, the Chinese, I think, say you are very unlucky if you live in interesting times, and we certainly live in interesting times at the moment. The title of my presentation comes from a quotation from Ban Ki-moon, pointing out how difficult times have become, with many natural disasters affecting the world and affecting many tourism destinations. Huge numbers of people being displaced, the effects of climate change, massive economic losses and massive costs. But Mr. Ban has said that the majority of these crises are predictable and we need to plan for them. Some tourism destinations, such as Nepal, can be devastated by earthquakes, but this earthquake was anticipated for many years. I was working there 10 years ago with the United Nations Development Program, and we were all given earthquake training because a major earthquake was known to be about to happen. It didn't happen for a further 10 years, but even when it did, still the country was not sufficiently prepared. We all know about tsunamis, their effect on Thailand and more recently in Japan. Again, major tourism destinations affected by natural disaster. Volcanoes affecting tourism, recently in Mexico, and European traffic being badly affected by the volcanoes in Iceland. And then, on top of that, there are major health crises looming. And the effect of the Zika virus is still perhaps unknown. But all of these are areas where plans have to be made for. And then finally, and most tragically, of course, there are the terrible events that war and politics impose on us, and much more difficult to predict. But those tourism destinations which are perceived to be secure and to have good security can capitalize on this, but it is of course a major tragedy that affects many, many destinations. And the internet, which has in many ways liberated tourism and totally changed booking systems, is also a reason why these crises have a much greater impact on tourism and make it much more difficult to market. The internet is dominating marketing, but it is also dominating the news. When something happens now, the whole world knows in a very short time. So, in this situation, how is tourism doing? Well, there are many, many problems, many incidents that affect tourism in many destinations. But overall, and in the long term, tourism still continues to grow, even up to the current times. The number of tourists grows each year, and the number of jobs supported by tourism continues to grow. So despite uncertainty, the sector grows at about 4% each year. Now obviously different regions are affected differently, and I will talk a little bit about that further in a moment. But the industry is clearly a very important industry in the global economy, and one that we must protect and stand over and continue to invest in. And you can see that happening, I think, in the work of UNWTO, which is becoming increasingly vocal about protecting tourism from the various incidents that have been happening over the past few years. To look at the different growth rates in a little bit more detail, Asia is perceived as being perhaps safer than other parts of the world, and it is showing huge tourism growth at the moment. I am currently working in Vietnam, and that country is certainly benefiting from the misfortunes that other parts of the world are having to suffer, because it is perceived as being safe. But despite this, the Middle East is continuing to grow well. And again, there are obviously regional differences. Egypt is having major problems. It used to be one of the major tourism destinations and is fighting back, but having great difficulty. So as you can see, the overall industry continues to grow, but there is a lot of regional variation. So what must the response be of a tourism destination? Well, governments need to set aside budgets for emergencies, because they will happen. And they have to help to build the capacity of destinations to recover from crises. And that means more planning and more training. And they have to look to risk assessment, doing risk audits, and trying to always improve the safety of tourists and of the tourism industry. And in particular, they need to acknowledge that there will be crises and to have a plan for those crises. I would now like to look at the situation of Greece, which is one of the main tourism destinations that is badly affected by the refugee crisis that's currently hitting Europe. Tourism is hugely important to the Greek economy, and it has been doing well. It was up 20% last year in 2015. Tourism revenues were increasing by 10%, and the average income per visitor was going down, but the numbers overall were positive. In 2014, Europe was still providing Greece a lot of business, with France and the UK the most important markets. But in overall terms, tourism in Greece is so important that it contributes about 25% of GDP. And the economy obviously is having its major difficulties with the euro crisis, but declines in tourism have further negative effects on it. So what is Greece doing? Well, it is running an advertising campaign to point out that the tourism decline is not as bad as people might anticipate. But some regions are very badly hit. In particular, the islands where the refugees arrive, and they have lost air connections as a result of the crisis. But they haven't been standing idly by. The Greek government has put together a major response package to deal with this crisis. And they are focusing that on the islands that are hardest hit by the refugee crisis. Helping these islands to market themselves and setting aside special funds for them. And they're also bringing journalists to these islands to show them that the refugees are actually moved away from tourism destinations, and that life there is not perhaps as bad as is perceived in the news media. As is often important in a tourism crisis, the domestic market has to be a focus of attention, because the domestic market is always with you and underpins the viability of any tourism destination. Here in Saudi Arabia, I know you have a particularly strong domestic tourism market, and that is a great strength to tourism here. But the main thing is to have a plan for managing a tourism crisis. If you don't have a plan, it's likely that the authorities will not know what to do about tourism, and it's an industry with so many stakeholders that unless there is clear communication and planning for what to do when a crisis occurs, if it occurs, stakeholders will become negative, and the crisis may be exacerbated, made worse. The organization, the tourist boards, or the region in which the crisis happens will get a negative image, and the length of time for addressing the crisis will be longer than it might otherwise be. So finally then, how to manage to manage tourism crises, how to plan for them. First of all, it's important that destinations assess their risks, do an audit, and be prepared. And that should be done at a national level, but also at a regional level, so that people know what the emergency plans are and know how it will be communicated. There should be in the organization, be it the Supreme Commission or a region, a crisis team, so that people have designated responsibilities to react if a crisis that affects tourism happens. There needs to be a very clear chain of command, so that it is clear who the spokesperson will be and how decisions will be taken. If this is not clear and decisions cannot be taken where the crisis happens, it makes things worse. Whoever the spokesperson will be needs to be very carefully trained as to how to handle the media and what to say and what not to say. And we are becoming used, sadly, to crises happening on television. And you can very quickly work out those organizations that have spokespeople that are well trained and that are cool in a crisis and know how to handle the interviews. It's very important to know who the key stakeholders are and to brief them about what would happen if there was a crisis. And to have holding statements prepared so that when a crisis occurs, there is a press release that can be issued quite quickly to the media to reassure people, to express sympathy, and to say that further information will be made available as soon as it will come. This needs to be backed up by a policy as to what the communications strategy will be. And it's important that everybody in the organization understands how to communicate in a time of crisis and who will the spokespeople be. And that plan, of course, needs to be kept up to date. You need to see how other destinations handle crisis and learn from them. Sadly, they happen all the time. And then, if a crisis does happen, to review it honestly and see what can be done. So that concludes my presentation. It's a difficult subject, but a serious one, and one that needs to be considered, I think, by every potential tourism destination. I would be very happy to take any questions in Arabic or English. Our translators are helping. And thank you very much for so many people coming to listen today.
السلام عليكم. بالنسبة لخطط إدارة الأزمات، تحدثت يا دكتور عن وضع خطط قبل حدوث الأزمة. أثناء الأزمة هل يعني فيه خطط يعني ممكن توضع، أو كيف التعامل أثناء الأزمة؟ يعني أزمة حدثت ما كانت متوقعة، كيف يتعامل مع الأزمات الغير متوقعة؟
Well, it is usual to try to have an emergency plan in place, and the audit that you do would try to work out what kind of crises are likely to happen. Maybe an incident at an airport or an incident at a hotel. You have to try to anticipate what these are, but while the nature of the particular emergency may change, the response to it is probably the same. You need to know how to get people to hospitals, you need to know how to handle the press, you need to know how to stop advertising if you're in charge of advertising for a certain period. So while it's difficult to know what a crisis might be or where it might happen, the response to it can be quite similar. A question that I often get asked is what to do about marketing in a time of crisis when a big incident happens, and how can a destination recover? When we were working in Northern Ireland and when a bomb would go off or somebody would be killed, there was a standard practice to withdraw, to stop advertising for a certain period out of respect. And then when things had quietened down and things were getting back to normal, the advertising would come back again. But in the longer term then, when a major event has happened, for example in Rwanda, where they had a terrible genocide for many years that had a huge impact on the country's tourism potential, what they did to market their way out of that was to concentrate on nature tourism, and to have a different image of Rwanda and try and change that image through marketing. So it became all about visiting mountain gorillas and heavily promoting that, which was quite successful in attracting international tourism interest. So much so that now there are not enough places to visit the gorillas because the capacity is limited. There aren't that many of them. And so now they're having to change their tourism marketing again, and they're moving towards MICE and conference tourism. So the marketing after a crisis is an area that will require very careful study and very careful research to track public opinion and public perceptions, and to know when is the right time to go back into the market.
تحسين الصورة الذهنية للجهة بعد حدوث الأزمة. يعني اليوم شاهدنا في الأخبار اختطاف طائرة مصرية أثرت على أو قد تؤثر على السياحة في مصر. قبلها الطائرة اللي انفجرت في سيناء. كيف يتم تحسين الصورة الذهنية؟ هل هي من إدارة الأزمات تحسين الصورة الذهنية للجهة؟
Yes, a very good question. I have worked a lot in Egypt, and it is a destination I am very fond of, and what is happening there is very tragic. At the end of the day, it is going to require a political solution for tourism to fully recover. But I know that the Minister for Tourism, Mr. Zazou, and that the Egyptian Tourism Authority's advertising agency are coming up with new campaigns and trying to identify markets that are less impacted by what is happening. For example, they're looking to Arab markets that are more used to these situations and know that in reality life in Egypt is not as bad as it might appear. In the past, when the first revolution happened, they looked very much to Russia because Russians were felt to be less impacted by negative publicity than other markets. Now, following the Sharm el-Sheikh incident, that isn't possible at the moment. But it's a question of being fast on your feet, knowing your research, knowing which markets to target to help the industry to recover. But at the end of the day, most tourists want to go to destinations that are safe, and so there has to be a security response and a political response to make the industry fully thrive.